A reading from the letter of St. James. Brethren, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good life let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This wisdom is not such as comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, without uncertainty or insincerity. And the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. The word of the Lord.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus came to the disciples, he saw a great crowd about them, and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a dumb spirit, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has he had this?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You dumb and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him, and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer and fasting." The Gospel of the Lord. One of the beautiful things about Mark's Gospel is all of the details, but also the rush with which he seems to move through each of the scenes. He kind of moves very quickly through each of the details, almost as if he's kind of rushing to tell the beautiful story of the Lord. But all of those details, they have so much meaning, and so this scene has so much depth. And I know we've looked at it before, and I'm sure I've mentioned some of the patristic insights, but I'll mention them, at least some of them again here, just because I believe they're so profound, some of the things that we see happening here. So the Lord is coming down the mountain after the transfiguration, and what he finds is he sees this crowd, and there is discord, a lack of peace, a lack of harmony, argument going on in the midst of the multitude. And what we see throughout the life of Christ is that the multitude seldom accomplishes anything meaningful, right? So whenever we act as a multitude or as a mob, it is never how we are created to act. We are not called to think as the multitude thinks, but to act according to the truth, act according to our conscience. And so sometimes the temptation with acting with a multitude is that we hand over our thinking and our decisions to a mob, to something that might be and never can accomplish the will of God. And so what we see here is that there is this multitude gathered, and there is a lot of discord and a lack of peace. And what we know from the first reading is that that is a sign not of the Spirit and of the wisdom of God, but of an evil spirit. And so one of the signs of the activity of evil is a lack of peace and discord and argumentation. And so the Lord comes down, and the crowd, you can see the first thing that breaks them from this argumentation is that they see Christ. As soon as they see him, they are struck with amazement, and they all come gathering to him again. So his presence has an impact already. He doesn't have to say anything. Simply the presence of Jesus Christ begins to return peace to where discord and evil and sinfulness and argumentation and pride and all of those things have crept in. The Lord himself, the wisdom from above, literally coming to them from above. He's coming down the mountain to this crowd. And as he arrives there, his presence, as we've said, begins to disperse this, all of this kind of evil that is happening. And he also then interjects his words. He asks them a question. He starts to get them to think rightly. And so he says, "What are you discussing with them?" And he kind of puts himself into the conversation so that he can guide it according to his truth. And then it says, one of the crowd answered him. And I've always found this interesting with this scene, because this one of the crowd, slowly we get to know who he is. In the crowd, he has almost lost his identity. But as soon as he begins to pull himself out of the crowd, as soon as he begins to speak from the crowd, eventually we come to know him. And at the end of the scene, he is known as the father of the child. The father of the child. So he goes from just being one amongst the multitude to being the father of the child. Who he is, we come to know him a little bit more deeply as the Lord separates him from this kind of mob mentality. And then he says, "Teacher, I brought my son to you." And he gives the description, for he has a dumb spirit, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And so we can see that that is generally the activity of evil, which is always a downward movement, right? A pulling down, a drawing down back into the things of the earth instead of towards the things of heaven. And we can see that what this young boy is experiencing is almost a foretaste of the sufferings of hell. Hell is described often in Scripture as the place where there is the grinding of teeth, right? An eternal frustration. And so this boy is suffering under that, a type of a foretaste of the sufferings of hell. And he becomes rigid, unable to move, unable to do anything. And he says, "I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." I find that statement very telling as well. Because what he is saying there, by saying that I asked your disciples, he is saying that he is not one of them. And I think that that's very telling. He is not yet a disciple of Jesus Christ, and that is part of the problem. And so he is trying to shift the blame, this father. Obviously, he loves his child. He wants his child to be well, but the blame is not upon himself, it's not upon the child, it's someone else's problem. Your disciples, they could not do it. And the Lord won't tolerate this. And so he begins to question the father. He says, "How long has he had this?" And the father says, "From childhood." So we know that from childhood means from the years of innocence. So the child himself is not guilty of his situation. And the Lord then continues to question him. And then the father says, "If you can do anything." Another very telling statement. He's not confident in the power of Christ yet. So he's not a disciple of Christ. He's not yet confident in the power of God and the power of Christ. And so he says, "If you can do anything, have mercy on us." But he finishes his prayer with that wonderful petition. Have mercy, have pity, have compassion. And the Lord's heart is always moved with compassion. And so Jesus says, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." The Lord doesn't simply want to restore the boy to health. He also wants to restore the father to faith. The faith of the father is important to the Lord. And then the father replies, and it says here, immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." I believe, but I acknowledge it's not yet perfect. I believe, but I acknowledge that it's still very little. My faith is small. And so he asks the Lord, help my unbelief, increase my faith, increase my belief. And before, it says, when Jesus saw the crowd running together again, so before the multitude can gather together again, the Lord dismisses and rebukes the unclean spirit. And he commands this unclean spirit to be cast out. And it convulses the boy terribly. And then it comes out, and the boy is left almost like he is dead. It's the effects, the horrible effects of evil that can happen. They leave behind them, the evil spirit always leaves behind him a trail of death. But this boy looks like he is dead. He has, and he is experiencing the after effects of the evil that has been present in his life. But he is restored to life again by the author of life. And the author of life doesn't have to do anything complicated. He simply takes the boy by the hand, lifts him up, and it says, he arose. The one who will rise from the dead now raises this young boy from a state of what appears to be death. And then when they are private, no longer in the multitude, the disciples, they always converse with the Lord after he has worked great miracles or spoken these parables. They converse with him privately. And that's what we are invited to. We are invited to private conversations with God. That is what prayer is. Why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer and fasting. It's not that we will assemble a mob and achieve the things that we want to achieve. Great things are achieved only through prayer and fasting, through private conversations with God in our own life, speaking to him and listening to him. That is what transforms us, and that is what will transform the world. Amen.